The Weimar Abyss, Hyperinflation, and the Golden Twenties. 1918. Germany lies in ruins, not so much physical as economic and moral. After its defeat in World War I, the country is financially devastated, humiliated by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and engulfed in revolutionary chaos. The newly born Weimar Republic has inherited a heavy burden: territorial losses, mountains of debt, and humiliating reparations to the Allies. The German mark, once a strong currency, rapidly depreciated. Successive governments tried to pay their bills by printing more and more money, fueling terrible inflation. Despair spread as people saw their savings melt away before their eyes, and prices creep up by the hour. The year 1923 arrives, a year that Germans will remember as a dark one. France and Belgium send troops into the Ruhr region, angry over the non-payment of reparations. In response, Berlin calls for passive resistance. Workers go on strike. Production stops. The authorities decide to pay the strikers by simply printing more banknotes, a last desperate step that adds fuel to the fire of hyperinflation. Imagine, the German government is effectively turning on the printing press at full speed, covering the abyss of debt with paper. The consequences are staggering. Prices explode exponentially. In January 1923, $1 US was worth 17,000 marks. In July, already 353,000 marks. In September, 98 million marks. In November, 2.2 trillion marks. By December, the exchange rate had reached an absurd 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. Money depreciated so rapidly that it ceased to perform its main function. Contemporaries described this fever with horror and amazement. In October 1923, Betty Scholem, housewife in Berlin, wrote to her son, "The situation here has taken a catastrophic turn. This letter cost 15 million marks to send, and the day after tomorrow it will be 30 million marks." She complains that her family's expenses have long been calculated in billions. At the same time, newspapers publish photos of children building toy houses out of stacks of banknotes, money cheaper than the paper on which it's printed. Germans burn banknotes in their stoves instead of firewood, because it is cheaper. The financial system is turning to ashes. A kilo of butter costs more than a whole cow did a few years ago, and a pound of rye bread costs over 100 billion marks. Salaries are paid twice a day and spent immediately before they lose all their value. Berlin journalist Friedrich Kroner jokes bitterly. A brand new banknote, still damp from the printing press, issued today as a week's pay, will lose its value before your eyes by the time you get to the store. Kroner's advice is simple: buy something immediately. Buy, because tomorrow the money will be worthless. Hyperinflation affects not only people's stomachs but also their minds. The middle class, who had been saving for retirement all their lives, lost everything. Their accounts were wiped out in a matter of months. Germany is engulfed in social collapse. Farmers refuse to bring food to the cities for worthless pieces of paper, and in the cities there is hunger rioting and looting. In September 1923, the government declares a state of emergency, close to martial law, to deal with the wave of violence. It was everyone against everyone else. This economic collapse sowed hatred, despair, and bitterness, which would soon become fertile ground for radicals. The rise in prices brought with it hatred, despair, and hardship, noted Kroner, observing the huge queues for food. People are looking for someone to blame. Many curse the government and the Weimar democracy, while others seek scapegoats among speculators or minorities. Against this backdrop, in November 1923, far-right adventurers led by Adolf Hitler made an unsuccessful attempt to seize power in Munich, the so-called beer hall putsch. The first warning sign of the coming turmoil came amid the chaos of hyperinflation. And yet 1923 was not the end of Germany, but a turning point. The country found itself on the brink of the abyss and looked into it. In September 1923, a new chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, came to power, a man who would stabilize the situation almost miraculously. In October, he stopped passive resistance in the Ruhr, recognizing the reality it was necessary to negotiate with the West. At the same time, monetary reform was carried out. A temporary currency, the Rentenmark, backed by real estate, was introduced to restore confidence. With tough measures, Stresemann stopped hyperinflation in just a few months. The price of bread stopped doubling every day, and the panic subsided. And then, even more unexpectedly, help came to Germany from its former enemies. In 1924, international creditors adopted the Dawes Plan, easing the terms of reparations payments for Berlin. The U.S. agreed to provide Germany with a loan of 800 million marks to kickstart the economy. The French withdraw their troops from the Ruhr. The country breathes a sigh of relief. Stability, at last. The so-called Golden Twenties begin, a short period of relative prosperity and cultural revival. German industry revives. Factories are once again humming with machinery. Unemployment falls sharply, from 4 million in the crisis year of 1923 to less than 2 million at the end of the decade. As American loans flow into the economy, wages and production are rising. By 1928, Germany's industrial production even exceeds pre-war levels. On the streets of Berlin, nightclubs are lit up with lights. Jazz and shimmy captivate young people. It seems that the horrors of war and inflation are behind them. The capital is called Babylon on the Spree. It is a center of art, theater, and scientific discoveries. It seems that life is getting back on track. But despite the outward glamour, the foundations of German prosperity remained shaky. The country had risen from its knees largely thanks to borrowed oxygen, short-term loans from across the ocean. Foreign Minister Stresemann, who secured Germany's place in the League of Nations and the Nobel Peace Prize, understood perfectly well how fragile this success was. The economic situation is only prosperous on the surface. In reality, Germany is dancing on a volcano. If the Americans withdraw their loans, a significant part of our economy will collapse, he warned in September 1929. And these words proved prophetic. In October 1929, just a few weeks after Stresemann's death, the volcano erupted. The collapse of the New York Stock Exchange sent shockwaves around the world. Germany, which had never strengthened the foundations of its economy, was the first to be hit by this financial tsunami. The Great Depression, the road to radicalism. The end of 1929 brought Germany a new shock. The Great Depression, the most severe economic crisis on a global scale. What meant a stock market crash for America turned into a real disaster for Germany. American banks suddenly demanded repayment of their loans, and credit taps were turned off almost instantly. The German economy, which had been dancing on a volcano of foreign money, suddenly stumbled and fell. Between 1929 and 1932, Germany's industrial production fell by almost 40%. Factories shut down and thousands of businesses went bankrupt. Exports came to a standstill. The world no longer bought German goods. Rivers of unemployed people flowed through the streets of cities. The unemployment rate rose from 8% to almost 30% in 3 years. By the beginning of 1933, more than 6 million Germans were out of work, 1 in 3 of the working-age population. These are not just numbers, they are millions of broken lives, engineers selling matches on the sidewalks, parents not knowing how to feed their children, young people losing hope for the future. The pictures of those years are depressing. Queues for free soup stretch for blocks. On the outskirts of Berlin, the unemployed rummage through garbage cans in search of coal to heat their families. Families evicted for non-payment of rent spend the night in cold stairwells. Newspapers are full of reports of suicides out of desperation. There is a rapid increase in cases where entire families poison themselves with gas or throw themselves off bridges. Companies are closing, farms are being auctioned off, and people are losing their minds from hopelessness, is how an American observer described the situation. Despair is spreading throughout Germany, and with it, anger. Anger at the Versailles Treaty, at greedy capitalists, at helpless politicians in Berlin. It is these bitter feelings that will fuel radical politics. The democratic Weimar government proved incapable of giving the people neither bread nor entertainment. In March 1930, the coalition government headed by the Social Democrat Müller collapsed, unable to agree on how to save the economy. Desperately seeking a way out, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed the conservative Heinrich Brüning as the new chancellor. Brüning decided that the solution lay in tightening the belt. He cut government spending, raised taxes, and reduced public sector wages and unemployment benefits. These harsh austerity measures soon earned Brüning the nickname Chancellor of Hunger. Ironically, fear of a repeat of the hyperinflation of 1923 made the government deaf to another danger: mass unemployment and impoverishment. Brüning hoped that discipline and austerity would restore business confidence, but the opposite happened. Each of his decisions only deepened the spiral of crisis. Prices fell, companies cut costs even more, and laid off workers. In 2 years of Brüning's policies, the economy fell by another 4.5% of GDP, and unemployment doubled. By mid-1932, millions of destitute people were roaming the country. For them, democracy was now associated only with queues for soup and newspaper headlines about new bankruptcies. Against the backdrop of this social collapse, the stars of radical parties both on the right and on the left were rising. On the one hand, there was the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, promising to crack down on capitalists and follow the Soviet path. On the other hand, there was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Adolf Hitler's Nazis, proclaiming slogans of national revival and revenge for Versailles. While the Nazis were a marginal force in the 1928 elections, less than 3% of the vote, by the fall of 1930, in the midst of economic turmoil, they had the support of 18% of voters, almost 6.5 million people. Over the next 2 years, their support only grew. In July 1932, the Nazis won the most seats in parliament, 37% of the vote, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag. The Communists rose to third place. The center was eroding. Only fragments remained of the multi-party democracy, and no government could hold a majority. Meanwhile, the streets of German cities resemble a battlefield. Nazi militants in brown shirts, SA stormtroopers, storm communist rallies, while communist Red Front fighters clash with the police and Nazis. Blood is shed almost daily. The Republic teeters on the brink of civil war. Why did millions of ordinary Germans, farmers, workers, shopkeepers, suddenly gravitate toward Hitler? Economic hardship played a decisive role here. Nazi propaganda skillfully hit where it hurt. Hitler promised jobs, Arbeitsplätze für alle, jobs for all, and bread, Brot und Arbeit, bread and work, offering simple answers to complex questions. Versailles, Marxists and Jewish speculators were to blame for everything. "We are the product of the misery caused by others," Hitler declared, shifting the responsibility for the suffering of the German people onto the democratic politicians of the old school. For the disadvantaged masses, such ideas were familiar and understandable. They saw Hitler not as a crazy extremist, but, as they believed, as a savior who spoke of their pain. One of the Nazi slogans summed it up: "Hitler is our last chance." Fatigue from anarchy was also a decisive factor. Many Germans were willing to sacrifice freedom for the sake of order. Moreover, the Democrats had almost discredited themselves. Since 1930, Brüning's government had ruled by presidential decree, bypassing the parliament under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. In fact, Germany had entered a period of semi-dictatorship even before the Nazis came to power, when Hindenburg and Brüning bypassed the Reichstag. In 1932, the situation reached absurdity. The country was ruled by technical chancellors whom no one had elected, General Kurt von Schleicher and then former aristocrat Franz von Papen. Neither had the support of the majority. Decrees were issued one after another, and politics turned into the backroom intrigues of a few people close to the president. Against this backdrop, even the conservative elites, frightened by the rise of communism, began to see Hitler as an acceptable option, a lesser evil that would curb the Red Chaos. On January 30, 1933, these elites conspired and finally brought Adolf Hitler to power. President Hindenburg appointed him Reichschancellor of Germany. This appointment was initially seen as a political compromise. Let Hitler head the government, but we will restrain him, limit him, and outlast him. But as we know from history, things turned out differently. The Great Depression paved the way for radicalism, and the Germans, exhausted by democracy, opened the door to dictatorship. Hitler got a chance he could not have dreamed of in his Munich cell 10 years earlier. The despair of millions became the pavement on the road to the Third Reich. The economy of the Third Reich, militarization as a plan. March 1933. Swastika flags are already flying in Germany, and stormtroopers are marching in the streets. But hope lives in the hearts of ordinary Germans. The new government promises to immediately tackle the most pressing issue: unemployment. No communists, no strikes, only a united nation rising from its knees, the speeches proclaim. And indeed, in a few years, what seemed like a miracle will happen. Unemployment will disappear, factories will be back in full swing, and the economy will rise from stagnation. But will the price paid for this be too high? Adolf Hitler understood that his power depended on the public's expectation of a miracle. Therefore, he acted quickly and decisively. The first steps were the elimination of trade unions and the banning of strikes in May 1933. The labor movement was brought under control, and the German Labor Front was created, where all entrepreneurs and employees were united under Nazi leadership. No more quarrels between labor and capital. From now on, the state dictates the terms. Salaries are frozen at pre-war levels, and any demands for higher wages or better working conditions are equated to sabotage. Entrepreneurs breathe a sigh of relief. They can work without fear of strikes and socialist experiments. These concessions to business are part of the Nazi agreement. Big industry supports Hitler, and in return, Hitler gives it free rein to make profits and guarantees the destruction of left-wing trade unions. The key figure on the economic front in the early days was Hjalmar Schacht, a talented banker and hero of the 1923 stabilization. Hitler appointed him head of the Reichsbank, and in 1934 he also became Minister of Economics. This reassured the business community. They figured that an extremist like Hitler wouldn't risk economic adventures if he had a respectable technocrat like Schacht by his side. Indeed, for the first couple of years, the Nazis cautiously continued some of the policies established under the von Schleicher government in 1932, namely state investment in public works. Simply put, the state spent money to give people jobs. While there was a lack of political will for this during the Weimar Republic, there were now no obstacles. The Reichstag had been effectively eliminated, and there was no opposition. In June 1933, Hitler announced a huge infrastructure construction program worth 1 billion Reichsmarks. Large-scale projects were launched across the country. Roads, bridges, canals, schools, and housing were built. The most famous of these was the construction of the Autobahn, a network of modern motorways. Thousands of unemployed people were hired to dig trenches, lay concrete, and assemble bridges. More than 80,000 workers are employed in the construction of motorways, and when related industries such as cement, steel, and machinery are taken into account, the effect is even greater. At the same time, projects are being implemented to drain swamps for agriculture, build railways, and construct new factories. Through the Reinhardt program, the state is stimulating the private sector with tax breaks for job creation. This is all called the battle for work, Schlachtarbeit. And Hitler is winning this battle quickly. The figures speak for themselves. In less than 5 years of Nazi rule, official unemployment fell from 6 million to minimal levels. By 1936, it was less than 1 million, and by 1939, statistics recorded almost full employment, less than 1%. This is a truly impressive achievement, the largest reduction in unemployment among all countries affected by the Depression. Germans saw the changes with their own eyes. Yesterday, my neighbor was standing on the corner with his hand outstretched, and today he has a job and a recruit's uniform again, they said in those years. Indeed, a significant portion of young unemployed people were simply drafted into the army. In 1935, the Nazis boldly violated the Treaty of Versailles and introduced universal military service, forming the Wehrmacht. Hundreds of thousands of young men became soldiers, which also led to a sharp drop in unemployment statistics. Others were sent to improvised labor camps. As part of the Reich Labor Service, RAD, young people in the camps underwent semi-military labor training, working on public works for a symbolic wage. Of course, officially, such workers were no longer counted as unemployed. Separately, women were encouraged to stay at home, in their circle. Housewives also dropped out of the labor market. Thus, the Nazis partially hid unemployment through statistical manipulation, but the overall effect was still real and tangible. People got at least some work and confidence in the future. You no longer see mass protests on the streets. The people are busy building the 1,000-year Reich. Behind the ostentatious glamour of the Nazi economic miracle lies one fundamental truth. From the very beginning, the economy of the Third Reich was geared towards war. Jobs weren't created for the sake of prosperity itself. They were a byproduct of a grand plan to put the country in military boots. Hitler never hid this priority. The future of Germany depends exclusively on the rebuilding of the armed forces. All other tasks must take a back seat, he stated bluntly at the beginning of his reign. If the demands of the Wehrmacht conflict with any others, the military always has the priority, was the directive, and in practice, that is exactly what happened. As soon as Hitler consolidated his power in 1933-34, spending on Germany's secret rearmament skyrocketed. By mid-1933, 3 times more money had been allocated to military needs than to all public works programs. In the following years, this gap only grew. Germany rearmed faster than any other country in peacetime. The share of military spending rose from 1% of GDP in 1933 to 10% in 1935. By comparison, other Western countries were still economizing after the war at that time. By the end of the decade, the military budget had simply taken over the economy. Between 1933 and 1939, about 60% of all German government spending went to the army. By 1939, the Nazi government had spent 35 billion Reichsmarks on rearmament, a colossal sum. To put this into perspective, the country's national income in 1933 was $43 billion. In fact, the entire country was working to create a huge military machine. New tank factories, shipyards for military vessels, design bureaus, and training grounds were being built. In addition to recruiting conscripts, the Wehrmacht ordered hundreds of aircraft, guns, and vehicles, which also created jobs, especially in cutting-edge industries. How did Germany manage to pay for all this? After all, the state treasury was empty, and the printing press could not be turned on again without scrutiny. The memory of 1923 was still alive. This is where Scheimal Schacht's ingenuity came into play. He devised a clever financial scheme to finance rearmament secretly without alarming either the Germans or foreign observers. The scheme was called MIFO bills. The government created a fictitious company called the Metallurgical Research Society, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, abbreviated MIFO, on behalf of which it issued debt obligations, bills of exchange, that were accepted as payment by defense contractors. In fact, it was money, but not official Reichsmarks, so it didn't appear in the budget. MIFO bills of exchange could be exchanged for real money at the Reichsbank at any time, but Schacht was cunning. He constantly extended their maturity, persuading industrialists to hold on to the papers rather than demand payment in gold. The printing press was still working, but in the shadows. When the time came to pay, the Reichsbank quietly printed the necessary amount of Reichsmarks to cover its obligations, and the issue was spread out in a thin layer without causing a sharp jump in prices. Of course, this could not last forever. By 1938, more than 12 billion Reichsmarks had accumulated in the form of Mifo bills, and when a significant portion of them became due for payment, the Treasury was in danger of running out of money. The government had to resort to manipulation. It forced private banks to buy government bonds and simply confiscated part of the population's savings and insurance companies' assets to cover the deficit. These were the first warning signs. The Reich's economy was bursting at the seams from overload. However, everything looked brilliant at first. Inflation was kept under control. Prices in the mid-1930s were stable thanks to strict state control. The Nazi government simply froze prices for many goods and tariffs, introduced rent control, and froze wages back in 1933. Workers were, of course, dissatisfied that their wages weren't increasing, but no one asked them. Any protests were suppressed by force. Small farmers, on the other hand, suffered. Fixed low prices for their products squeezed out small farms, and many went bankrupt. But the poverty of the countryside was ignored. Propaganda emphasized grandiose achievements. Queues reappeared in cities, but not for bread, but for car dealerships. The authorities began to advertise the people's car, the Volkswagen, an inexpensive car for every German family. Although by 1939, no buyer had received their car. The factory had switched to the production of military equipment. Shop windows were once again filled with goods. The unemployed received uniforms and albeit meager rations. It seemed that the Nazis had achieved the impossible, pulling the country out of the mire of depression. No wonder foreign guests, from American businessmen to British industrialists, visited the Third Reich and marveled. Here it is, the efficiency of an authoritarian state. The National Socialists were not shy about flaunting their successes. Unemployment had been defeated, the Communists had been destroyed, the humiliation of Versailles had been erased. But what was the real price of this economic miracle? The price was freedom and peace. Germany gained illusory prosperity, giving its soul to the devil of war in return. The country had already turned into a giant military camp. You either work or fight. There are almost no other options. Those who did not fit into the new economy of blood and iron were forcibly removed. Jews and political opponents were dismissed from their posts, and their places were taken by decent Aryans. This is how the Nazis also reduced unemployment. By dismissing hundreds of thousands of Jews, women, and dissidents, they gave the vacancies to their supporters. Those who resisted were sent to concentration camps and forced labor. The policy of forced labor in the Third Reich gained momentum. First, it was compulsory labor for young people through the RAD, and then the increasingly widespread use of slave labor by prisoners. By the end of the 1930s, prisoners, including opponents of the regime who had been thrown into camps, were already working on construction sites and in factories. And this was only the beginning. Later, with the outbreak of war, the Nazi economy would parasitize on millions of slaves from conquered countries. But even before 1939, the Nazi economy was a deeply cynical system. It achieved external splendor through total control, deception, and preparation for wars of plunder. On the eve of 1939, the Third Reich looked powerful and prosperous. However, Minister of Economics Schacht felt increasingly anxious. He saw that the state finances were on the verge of collapse. At the end of 1937, Schacht even dared to contradict the Führer, saying that military spending should be slowed down because the treasury was empty. The response was merciless. An angry Hitler dismissed Schacht and handed over control of the economy to his confidential Göring. Hermann Göring, a former pilot, was given extraordinary powers as planner at the head of the four-year plan from 1936. This plan was intended to prepare Germany for war in 4 years by ensuring maximum self-sufficiency in everything necessary. Goering's iron fist now directed the economy. Import quotas were established, control over raw materials was tightened, and resources were thrown into synthetic production of gasoline and rubber to reduce dependence on external supplies. Some captains of industry, such as aircraft manufacturer Hugo Junkers, who dared to argue, were removed and effectively ruined. Private property formally remained, but business had to play by the rule of guns above all else. Goering's phrase was telling, "We have no butter, but I ask you, is it not better to have guns than butter? After all, guns will make us powerful, while butter will only make us fat." This cynical joke loudly proclaimed the priorities. The people could do without extra butter on their bread, as long as the country forged weapons. By the fall of 1939, the German economy was essentially at war. All that remained was to officially begin hostilities. The Reich's national debt had ballooned to 38 billion Reichsmarks. The budget deficit had reached unprecedented levels, which were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Government circles realized that without plundering foreign resources, the country would face bankruptcy. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, quietly wrote in his diary about his concerns. The coffers were empty, and things could not go on like this. But Hitler had his B plan, conquest. The Nazi leadership expected that the newly conquered territories, with their deposits, factories, and food supplies, would become the treasure that would cover Germany's debts and expenses. The upcoming territorial expansion will enable us to pay off our debts with the wealth and labor of the conquered peoples, was the thinking at the top of the Third Reich. There was no room for economic miracles in this chilling logic, only the cold calculation of a conqueror who puts everything on the line for war. On September 1, 1939, this calculation was put into action. With the attack on Poland, Hitler unleashed World War II. The German economy, wound up to the limit, finally exploded outward. Tanks, planes, army columns all set out to reap the dividends from their neighbors. A new, bloodiest chapter in history began. But that's a topic for another video. Our view of the path that led Germany from ruins to the Reich between the two world wars is full of lessons and bitter irony. Conclusions, cynicism, and lessons learned. The story of Germany's economic miracle between 1918 and 1939 is more like a knife-edge rise. It took only 2 decades to go from total collapse after World War I to a rapid revival of industrial power, but at what cost? Let's take a sober look. The first act, the Weimar Abyss, showed how devastating economic turmoil can break a society. Hyperinflation destroyed people's trust in the state and in each other, spreading resentment and extremism. The Great Depression finished off democracy, driving the population to such despair that they elected a dictator. Economic instability became the gravedigger of political freedom. The lesson is very simple and very frightening. When millions have nothing to feed their children, they will believe anyone who promises order and bread, even if it means tyranny. The second act, the Nazi recovery of the economy, teaches us something else. Yes, the Nazis eliminated unemployment and got factories up and running again, but they did so by plunging the country into militarism and total control. In fact, Hitler solved the problem of unemployment by turning the unemployed into soldiers and slaves of the military economy. Germany in the 1930s became a kind of factory working in 3 shifts to produce tanks and guns, where workers had no right to vote, no choice of where to work, and not even the right to demand decent wages. This was not a normal economic recovery. It was the mobilization of the country for a new war. The Nazi economic miracle turned out to be a bubble filled with explosives. Debts and deficits hidden behind shiny statistics were to be repaid by plundering neighbors. And when this bubble burst, the world was engulfed in war. It is a bitter irony that Germany, which had so desperately clawed its way out of the ruins of World War I, under Nazi leadership, led itself into new ruins, much more terrible ones. In 1945, the country lay completely bombed out, divided and drained of blood. the price for the illusory prosperity of the 1930s. The promised thousand-year Reich lasted 12 years, leaving behind millions of dead and the mark of the greatest crime against humanity. This story is a warning and a lesson for us all. Cynicism in politics and economics may bear short-term fruits, but it is poisonous. The Nazi regime demonstrated miracles of efficiency, but at the heart of this efficiency lay violence, lies, and a thirst for conquest. It is impossible to build lasting prosperity on blood and fear. If a state puts guns before butter, sooner or later it will have neither. As one historian noted, the Nazi economy was like a person who took out a loan knowing that he would repay it by robbing his neighbor. But the neighbors did not remain in debt either. The world united to destroy the Nazi monster, and Germany was left in ruins once again. The lesson can be summed up in words attributed to the Weimar era. The economy is the foundation on which everything stands. The fate of entire nations depends on the health of this foundation. When the economic system collapses, adventurers come along, ready to build their thrones on the ruins, as Hitler did. And when an economic boom grows on the sin of aggression, it inevitably turns into a disaster for everyone. A true economic miracle is when prosperity is achieved without war and oppression, based on the creative work of free people. Unfortunately, between the two world wars, Germany was destined to experience a completely different scenario. Thus, from ruins to the Reich, Germany has traveled a path that today serves as a grim reminder. There are no quick and easy solutions that justify dictatorship and militarism. Any economic miracle built on cynicism and violence will sooner or later turn into a tragedy. Let's keep this in mind when we hear sweet promises of simple solutions in difficult times. And let's remember the volcano beneath our feet, so that we don't start dancing on its edge again.